All right, welcome to another episode of Mike Reads. Today we'll be continuing in our series on Discrimination and Disparities by Thomas Sowell with the final chapter in the book, Chapter 5, entitled Social Visions and Human Consequences. We should be able to get this read done in 2 reads. I'm also going to read the acknowledgments in the next video as we finish up the second half of Chapter 5. So without further ado, let's dive right on in. Social Visions and Human Consequences. Many people may expect discussions of economic and social disparities to end with solutions, usually something that the government can create, institutionalize, staff, and pay for with the taxpayers' money. The goal here is entirely different. There has never been a shortage of people eager to draw blueprints for running other people's lives. But any solution, however valid as of a given moment under given conditions, is subject to obsolescence at some later time under changed conditions. The hope here is that clarification is less perishable and can be applied to both existing issues related to economic and social disparities and to new issues involving the same subject that are sure to arise with the passage of time. Given the limitations of prophecy, the point here is to seek to provide enough clarification to enable others to make up their own minds about the inevitable claims and counterclaims sure to arise from those who are promoting their own notions or their own interests. The invincible fallacy. At the heart of many discussions of disparities among individuals, groups, and nations is the seemingly invincible fallacy that outcomes in human endeavors would be equal, or at least comparable or random, if there were no biased interventions on the one hand, nor genetic deficiencies on the other. This preconception, which spans the ideological spectrum, is in utter defiance of both logic and empirical evidence from around the world and over millennia of recorded history. As noted in Chapter 1, individual prerequisites for success in various endeavors may be more or less normally distributed, as in a bell curve, but that does not mean that the presence of all the prerequisites simultaneously will also be normally distributed. Whether among human beings or in nature, highly skewed distributions of outcomes with multiple prerequisites have been common around the world. Nevertheless, the fallacy persists that skewed distributions of income, employment, and other social outcomes show either discrimination or genetic deficiencies. The human species can be divided and subdivided in many ways, by race, sex, age, birth order, or by the different geographic settings in which people have lived. Coastal peoples compared to inland peoples, mountain peoples compared to peoples living in river valleys, and so on. Among all these subdivisions and others, large disparities in outcomes have been the rule, not the exception. The real per capita income that Britain reached in 1880 was not reached by Spain until 1960, and by Portugal until 1970, and at these later dates, the real per capita income in both Spain and Portugal was not quite half that in contemporary Britain. Homicide rates in Eastern Europe have, for centuries, been some multiple of homicide rates in Western Europe, and homicide rates in different regions of the United States have likewise differed by some multiple. Yet Britain had no power to suppress the economic development of Spain or Portugal, just as Western Europe had no power to make the homicide rate higher in Eastern Europe. Disparities do not imply discrimination, nor is discrimination automatically excluded. It is one of many possibilities, each of which has to establish its claim with evidence, rather than being an automatic presumption. As already noted, even such natural phenomena as earthquakes, lightning, and tornadoes likewise show highly skewed distributions around the world, as well as within the same country. Thunderstorms are 20 times as frequent in southern Florida as in coastal California, for example. More than half the geysers in the entire world are in Yellowstone National Park. Asia has more than 70 mountain peaks higher than 20,000 feet, and Africa has none. The litany of highly skewed outcomes, both among humans and in nature, is almost limitless. Nevertheless, an implicit assumption persists that equal, or at least comparable outcomes would exist among different groups of people except for adverse interventions against some or genetic deficiencies among others. These are not just theoretical issues. The ramifications impact laws and policies. The Supreme Court of the United States has enshrined the prevailing fallacy in the form of its disparate impact standard for presuming discrimination. Yet median age differences among groups varying by a decade or decades are alone enough to preclude proportional representation in occupations requiring either long years of experience or the physical vitality of youth, even if all groups were absolutely identical in every other aspect besides age. Age disparities exist among nations as among individuals. There are more than 20 nations with median ages in their 40s, and more than 20 other nations with median ages in their under 20. How rational is it to expect nations with such large and consequential differences in adult experience to have equal or even comparable economic productivity? Among nations, as among individuals, age differences are just one difference among many. Seekers of social justice, in the sense of equal or comparable outcomes, proceed as if eliminating racial, sex, or other group discriminations would produce some approximation of that ideal. But what of the implications of the fact that a majority of the people in American prisons were raised with either one parent or no parent? This does not even get into the qualitative dimensions of parenting, though we know that educational differences among parents have been correlated with differences in educational and career outcomes among their children, even when those offspring were men who were all in the top 1% in IQs. Sometimes just a single inconspicuous difference in circumstances can make a huge historic difference in human outcomes. One of the monumental natural catastrophes of the 19th century was the famine in Ireland that was due to the failure of the potato crop at a time when potatoes were the principal food of the Irish. Deaths by starvation and by disease related to malnutrition are estimated to have claimed 1 million lives in Ireland, a country of only 8.5 million people at the time. Nearly 2 million people are estimated to have fled that famine-stricken country between the mid-1840s and the mid-1850s. Altogether a massive loss of population in a small country. Yet the very same kind of potato was grown in the United States, where Ireland's potatoes originated, with no crop failure. The source of that crop failure has been traced to a fertilizer used in planting potatoes on both sides of the Atlantic. The fertilizer contained a fungus which flourished in the mild and moist climate of Ireland, but not in the hot, dry summers of Idaho and other potato-growing areas of the United States. That one difference meant millions of human tragedies and a massive loss of population from which Ireland did not recover until generations later. Morally neutral factors such as crop failures, birth order, geographic settings, technological advances, or demographic and cultural differences are among the many reasons why economic and social outcomes so often fail to fit the preconception of equal or comparable results. Yet morally neutral factors seem to attract far less attention than other causal factors which stir moral outrage, such as discrimination or exploitation. But our emotional responses tell us nothing about the causal weight of different factors, however much those emotional responses may shape political crusades and governmental policies. But which causal factors predominate at a given place or time is ultimately an empirical question, independent of our emotions or inclinations. Those who seem to be promising an end to existing disparities as a result of whatever policies they advocate may be promising what cannot be delivered, regardless of the particular policies being advocated. Moreover, the clash between numerical goals, fervently pursued, and the repeatedly frustrated attempts to reach those goals is not without social consequences, including dire consequences for society as a whole, and perhaps especially dire for the less fortunate, who suffer most when social order breaks down amid heady crusades. This is not to say that all attempts to help lagging individuals or groups are futile. On the contrary, many dramatic rises from poverty to prospect, and even rises to the forefront of human achievements, have occurred at various times in countries around the world. But seldom, if ever, has this been a result of policies based on the fallacy of assuming equal outcomes in the absence of group discrimination, or on the basis of an assumption of a fictitious sameness among peoples. The actual consequences of the prevailing social vision of our times cannot be assessed on the basis of its good intentions or even its plausibility. The real test is what has happened when it has been applied, and what the implications are of the social consequences. Educational implications. Among the institutions where the prevailing fallacy takes a painfully sweeping toll are those low-income and minority schools in America, and low-income white schools in England, where young thugs are allowed to destroy the education and the futures of other students there by making those other students and their teachers targets of daily disruptions, harassments, threats, and violence. In the United States, federal agencies have pressured and threatened schools where statistics show a disciplining of black male students at rates that are disproportionate to the disciplining of other students. The invincible fallacy in the background trumps the most blatant and disastrous realities right in front of our eyes. Even aside from any questions about differences in capabilities or potentialities, there are inescapable differences in what people want to do. Does anyone seriously believe that Asian American youngsters have as much interest in playing basketball as black youngsters have? Or does anyone doubt that the Asian youngsters' lesser interest in basketball may have something to do with the dearth of Asian Americans among professional basketball players? Differences in what individuals and groups want to do and are prepared to prioritize are too often ignored in many well-intentioned policies. The "No Child Left Behind" educational policies, for example, introduced during the administration of President George W. Bush, ignored the painful possibility that there was no such universal desire for education as implicitly assumed, and that some uninterested children's behavior prevented other children from learning. Given these ignored realities, the disruptive or violent children must be separated from others if those others are to have a decent chance for a decent education. Moreover, the need to separate the disruptive and violent children is independent of whether or not there is any solution currently available or on the horizon for changing the behavior of disruptive and or violent children. The alternative is to sacrifice the education of unending generations of poor and minority children until such indefinite time as a solution for misbehaving or violent classmates can be found. The extraordinary educational successes of some chains of charter schools in low-income minority neighborhoods may well be due, at least in part, to the self-sorting of families in those neighborhoods who care enough about better education for their own children to enter the lotteries by which applicants are chosen for admissions to charter schools. In short, disruptive and violent children are left behind in the public schools, the Bush administration approach notwithstanding. This is one of those second-best options, when the first-best option, punishing and or explicitly isolating disruptive and violent students from all of their students, is precluded for political or ideological reasons. Nor is this problem peculiar to the United States. There are some schools in England where classrooms have been described as being, quote, on the knife edge of anarchy most of the time, end quote. In both countries, 1/6 of the children are functionally illiterate. This is a painful waste of mental potential, and the poor can afford it least of all. More generally, government programs to transfer people en masse from bad environments to better environments in order to improve their prospects in life ignore vast amounts of empirical evidence that this simply does not work on any scale commensurate with its negative consequences to people into whose midst they are thrust. Moreover, those who promote such programs usually refuse to consider the possibility, even as a testable hypothesis, that it is precisely the presence of bad people with bad behavior patterns that makes bad environments bad, and a dearth of such people elsewhere that makes better environments better. Political implications. The most spectacularly successful political doctrine that swept into power in countries around the world in the 20th century was Marxism, based on the implicit presumption that differences in wealth were due to capitalists growing rich by keeping the workers poor through, quote, exploitation, end quote. This version of the invincible fallacy apparently seemed plausible to people in many different countries and cultures. But if the wealth of rich capitalists comes from exploitation of poor workers, then we might expect to find that where there are larger concentration of rich capitalists, we would find correspondingly larger concentrations of poverty. But the hard facts point in the opposite direction. The United States has more than 5 times as many billionaires as Africa and the Middle East put together, yet most Americans, including those living below the official poverty line, have a far higher standard of living than that of the populations of Africa and the Middle East. It would be difficult to find even a single country ruled by Marxists where the standard of living of working class people has been as high as that of working class people in a number of capitalist countries. This is despite the fact that the first and largest of the avowedly Marxist countries, the Soviet Union, was one of the most richly endowed nations in the world when it came to natural resources, if not the most richly endowed. Yet the standard of living of ordinary people in the Soviet Union was nowhere close to the average standard of living of ordinary people in most of Western Europe or in the United States or Australia. But here, as elsewhere, hard facts have been repeatedly trumped by heady visions such as that presented in the Communist Manifesto. Other, non-Marxist doctrines have been built on the same foundation of assumptions, and they too have had their sweeping political triumphs in the 20th century, usually in the form of expansive welfare states in the second half of that century, with the 1960s being their pivotal triumphant decade. Hypothesis testing has usually played a remarkably small role in these intellectual, legal, and political developments. Indeed, scholars who have tested prevailing views against hard data and found the prevailing views lacking have often encountered hostility and demonization rather than counter-evidence. Riots to prevent their speaking have disgraced many of the most prestigious academic campuses in the United States. Indeed, especially such campuses. Social implications. If these were simply intramural contests among the intelligentsia, there would be little reason for others to be concerned about them. But social visions, and even the very catchwords and verbal style in which those visions are discussed, diffuse far beyond those which create and elaborate social visions. When treating imprisoned murderers in England, for example, physician Theodore Dalrymple found them using the same passive voice sentence constructions found among the intelligentsia when discussing social pathologies. Murderers discussing their crimes say such things as, and quote, "the knife went in," end quote, instead of saying that they stabbed their victim. An echo of elite intellectuals even appeared in an old musical, West Side Story, where a character says, quote, "Hey, I'm depraved on account I'm depraved. I'm depraved on account I'm deprived," end quote. Intellectuals say it more sophisticatedly, but they are nevertheless saying essentially the same thing. While what they are saying might be a plausible hypothesis to be tested empirically, it is too often treated as an established fact, requiring no such testing. Yet neither in England nor in the United States was such depravity as rampant violence and other social pathology as common among low-income people in the first half of the 20th century, when they were more deprived in the second half, when the welfare state made them better off in material terms. The importance of social visions goes far beyond the rhetoric they spawn. In a democratic nation, there can be no welfare state without a social vision first prevailing politically, a vision justifying the creation or expansion of a welfare state. Moreover, the triumph of that vision in Western societies during the 1960s entailed far more than the welfare state itself. With the prevailing social vision came a more non-judgmental approach to behavior, as well as multiculturalism, a de-emphasis of policing and punishments, and an emphasis on demographically based fair shares for all. The reasons for all these beliefs were elaborated in many ways by many individuals and groups. What has been elaborated far less often are empirical tests as to the validity of those hypotheses, in terms of the results expected from following this vision versus what actually happened. It is not simply that the social vision, which greatly expanded the welfare state and undermined traditional moral values, failed to achieve all its goals and fostered some negative consequences. What is particularly salient is that various social pathologies, which had been declining for some years, decades, or even centuries, had a sudden resurgence as these new and often self-congratulatory ideas triumphed politically and socially in the 1960s on both sides of the Atlantic. In the United States, murder rates, rates of infection with venereal diseases, and rates of teenage pregnancies were among these social pathologies whose steep declines were suddenly reversed in the 1960s, as all these pathologies soared to new and tragic heights. After decades of declining murder rates in the United States, that rate by 1960 was just under half of what it had been in the 1930s. But the murder rate was reversed and doubled from 1960 to 1980 in the wake of new legal restrictions on law enforcement, in keeping with the new social vision. These trends and reversal of trends were not particular to the United States. A monumental treatise on the decline of violence in the world over the centuries, The Better Angels of Our Nature by Steven Pinker, pointed out that in Europe, quote, rates of violence did a U-turn in the 1960s, end quote, including, quote, a bounce in homicidal rates that brought them back to levels they had said goodbye to a century before, end quote. Perhaps the most striking and most alarming increases in violence and disorder were in places long known for law-abiding, orderly, and polite behavior, England being a preeminent example. American economist J.K. Galbraith happened to be in London in May 1945, when a crowd estimated at, quote, 200,000 or 300,000, end quote, and mostly young people, was gathered to celebrate the end of the war in Europe. He wrote this to his wife, quote, like all British crowds, it was most orderly, end quote. In sports competition, British competitors were renowned for their sportsmanship. In a 1953 soccer match, for example, the team leading with only 2 minutes to go saw an opposing player snatch victory from them with only seconds left in the game, and members of the losing team stood up and applauded him. But by the 1960s, such sportsmanship was gone, even in Britain's classic sportsmanlike game, cricket. Vulgar insults were now common among British players, and among players in British offshoot societies, Australia and New Zealand. The same social degeneration affected law-abiding behavior during the same era. London had a total of just 12 armed robberies all year in 1954, at a time when anyone could buy a shotgun. But in later years, armed robberies rose to 1,400 by 1981 and 1,600 in 1991, despite increasingly severe restrictions on the purchase of firearms. As for orderly crowds, in 2011, urban riots spread through London, Manchester, and other British cities, involving thousands of hoodlums and looters who set fire to homes and businesses, as well as beating and robbing people on the streets and throwing gasoline bombs at police cars. The coarsening of life took other forms in England during the era of the new social vision. it was not uncommon for men found unconscious on the streets and taken to hospitals where the medical staff worked to restore their health, to later speak insultingly and abusively to those who had cared for them. Insults and abuse of medical personnel became sufficiently widespread that the National Health Service posted signs in its facilities warning that abusive and threatening behavior toward the staff would be prosecuted. Other social pathologies, which had existed before, expanded to new magnitudes. These included fatherless children in urban riots. As of 1960, 2/3 of all black American children were living with both parents. That declined over the years until only 1/3 were living with both parents in 1995. 52% were living with their mother, 4% with their father, and 11% with neither. Among black families in poverty, 85% of the children had no father present. Although white families did not have nearly as high a proportion of children living with one parent as blacks had in 1960, nevertheless, the 1960s marked a sharp upturn in white children born to unwed mothers, to levels several times what they had been in decades preceding the 1960s. By 2008, nearly 30% of white children were born to unwed mothers. Among white women with less than 12 years of education, more than 60% of their children were born to unwed mothers in the first decade of the 21st century. These social patterns were not peculiar in the United States, but were common in a number of Western societies. In England and Wales, for example, 44% of children were born to unwed mothers in 2007. Other countries where more than 40% of children were born to unwed mothers included France, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and Iceland. In most of these countries, this represented a major increase just since 1980. Urban riots in America, which had been sporadic in earlier years, spread in massive waves from coast to coast during the 1960s. Educational standards and performances in American schools began a decades-long decline in the 1960s, whether measured by test scores, by professors' assessments of incoming college students, by students' own reports of their time spent studying, or by employers' complaints about a lack of basic skills among the young people they hired. The factors on which those with the prevailing social vision relied for educational success, more spending for education in general and racial integration for blacks in particular, proved to be of little or no effectiveness. Seldom does any era in human history have exclusively negative or exclusively positive trends. Perhaps the most often cited positive achievements of the 1960s in the United States were the civil rights laws and policies that put an end to racially discriminatory laws and policies in the South, especially the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Although this has often been credited to the social vision of the political left, in reality, a higher percentage of congressional Republicans than of congressional Democrats voted for these landmark laws. But facts that do not fit the prevailing vision tend to be simply ignored. Much of the social retrogression that took place on both sides of the Atlantic is traceable to the central tenet of the prevailing social vision, that unequal outcomes are due to adverse treatment of the less fortunate. This preconception became a fount of grievance-driven attitudes, emotions, and actions, including what has been aptly called decivilizing behavior in many contexts. Despite what was, at best, a mixed record of outcomes from the new social vision, and the new laws and policies that followed from that vision, the image of the 1960s has been celebrated in the media, in politics, and in academia, especially by those who took part in its social crusades. The response of one of the high-level participants in the 1960s crusades upon meeting best-selling author Shelby Steele, who had expressed some skepticism about the era, was not atypical. Quote, "Look," he said irritably, "only, and I mean only, the government can get to that kind of poverty, that entrenched deep poverty. And I don't care what you say. If this country was decent, it would let the government try again." End quote. Shelby Steele's attempt to focus on facts about the actual consequences of various government programs of the 1960s brought a heated response. Quote, "Damn it, we saved this country," he all but shouted. "This country was all about to blow up. There were riots everywhere. You can stand there now in hindsight and criticize, but we had to keep the country together, my friend." That a high official of the Lyndon Johnson administration of the 1960s could believe things so completely counter to demonstrable facts was one sign of the power of a vision. His claim that only government programs could effectively deal with deep poverty was contradicted by the plain fact that the black poverty rate declined from 87% in 1940 to 47% in 1960, prior to the greatest expansion of the welfare state that began in the 1960s under the Johnson administration. There was a far more modest decline in the poverty rate among blacks after the Johnson administration's massive, quote, war on poverty, end quote, programs began. As for ghetto riots, these were never as numerous, nor of such magnitudes of violence, in the 1940s and 50s as they became in the 1960s, when the social vision behind the welfare state became triumphant in politics, in educational institutions, and in the media. Nor were there similar numbers or magnitudes of violence and riots in the 1980s during the 8 years of the Reagan administration in which that social vision was repudiated. Much more is involved here than incoherent inferences from demonstrable facts by one man. This was a far too common example of the ability of a social vision to not only survive, but thrive in defiance of empirical evidence. All right, well, that concludes today's reading. The next reading, which should be the final reading in this book and should complete this book entirely, will begin with the subsection Solutions in Chapter 5. So until then, this has been Mike, signing off.